Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with a question that's often overlooked in the chaos of tanks, trenches, and global warfare. What did World War II soldiers actually eat? From American K-rations to German ersatz, spread, Soviet cabbage soup, to Japanese rice balls. Tonight we're unpacking history, one can of corned beef at a time. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who's tuning in across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that steady hum, and let's settle into tonight's journey together. Before a single shot was fired or a tank rolled across Europe, before planes screamed overhead, every military faced one simple but essential challenge: feeding its troops without making them sick in the process. Let's face it, when we think about WWII, we usually imagine epic battles, courage, and old newsreels. But how often do we wonder whether the guys storming the beach at Normandy had breakfast, and what that meal actually was? Spoiler: it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of soldiers across multiple continents wasn't just a cooking challenge, it was a logistical mess, often with a side of dysentery. Rations needed to be portable, shelf-stable, inexpensive, and ideally not bring you to tears after eating. Taste came in far behind other priorities, somewhere between won't explode if dropped and won't attract rats. Different countries tackled the problem differently. The US leaned on science, producing compact little boxes of hope known as K-rations. Germany initially issued hearty fare, meat, rye bread, then gradually downgraded to something that felt more like punishment in a can. Britain held on to tea like it was the last thread keeping the empire intact. Perhaps it was. The Soviets boiled cabbage with the reverence of a ritual. And the Japanese? They were often expected to travel light, survive on rice balls, and keep fighting. Food was more than sustenance. It was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold can of greasy meat could wreck them. Some soldiers grew oddly attached to their rations. Others vowed never to eat crackers again. Many didn't dream of glory. They dreamt of butter, fresh bread, and meals that didn't come in brown packaging. While generals strategized in war rooms, foot soldiers were in trenches, trading chocolate for cigarettes and hoping their bunkmates didn't snore through mess call. So tonight, we're not discussing who won which battle. We're exploring Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the unspoken war between soldiers and whatever lurked inside those ration tins. Because if there's one constant in warfare, it's this: everyone has to eat, even when the food fights back. Picture this: you're a US soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, dodged bullets, and haven't seen indoor plumbing in weeks. Your stomach is louder than enemy artillery. What's on the menu? The K-ration, a compact, calorie-dense cardboard package clearly designed by someone who never had to eat it. The K-ration came in 3 separate boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each was about the size of a brick, and sometimes just as pleasant to chew. These meals offered just enough nutrition to count as food, while mentally preparing you for whatever came next. Breakfast started strong, with a can labeled ham and eggs that resembled neither. Imagine the texture of Spam mixed with drywall. Add in rock-solid crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade, and, you guessed it, gum and cigarettes. Because nothing says good morning like nicotine. And yes, a single sheet of toilet paper. And so use wisely. Lunch didn't offer much of a reprieve. Maybe you'd get cheese spread, more chemical than cheese, another round of teeth-testing crackers, and a chocolate bar dense enough to qualify as battlefield equipment. No spoon? No problem. You'd improvise with a knife, a stick, or raw frustration. Dinner featured meat and beans, though the appearance was closer to a crime scene. More crackers, more gum, and maybe, if fortune favored you, a tiny fruit bar that tasted like someone had whispered apple near a block of sawdust. Despite the flavor, K rations were nutritional workhorses, 3,000 calories a day packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough seasoning to avoid total despair. Troops swapped components like seasoned inmates, chocolate for cigarettes, cheese for anything else, and always trying to dodge the trauma of the ham and eggs. But every now and then, there it was, a real Hershey bar, actual chocolate, a bite of home. That alone made the rest of the experience tolerable. So yes, K rations were dry, boxy, and tasted vaguely like regret, but they kept the troops going, one questionable meat product at a time. Now, if K rations were survival food, the D ration was something else entirely, more survival threat, disguised as dessert. At first glance, the D ration looked like a chocolate bar. It was packaged like a chocolate bar. It was issued as a chocolate bar. That's where the illusion ended. This wasn't your comforting candy bar experience. The D ration was designed alongside the US Army with 3 goals. 1, don't melt. 2, last forever. And 3, taste awful enough that no one would eat it unless absolutely necessary. It was about the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to deflect small arms fire. Soldiers claimed it stopped bullets, or at least their digestive systems. Its ingredients were technically edible: chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and cocoa fat. The result: a brown brick that doubled as either a meal or emergency construction material. Fee, such a harsh design, because these bars had to survive heat, cold, rain, sand, without becoming mush. And the military intentionally made them unappealing to discourage casual snacking. Mission very much accomplished. So hard it could break teeth. Many troops tried shaving it into hot drinks. Others just stared at it, baffled. Some legends say it was used as a hammer. But at 600 calories per bar, it could technically sustain a man through a day of fighting. Technically. If you were trapped behind enemy lines or stuck in a foxhole with only bad decisions for company, the D ration could keep you alive. Happy? Not quite. Eventually, the army realized that chocolate doubling as brickwork wasn't helping morale. Later versions were a little softer, a bit more palatable. But by then, the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same fondness as a root canal. So next time someone says chocolate fixes everything, tell them about the D ration, the bar that proved otherwise. If K rations were the military's idea of convenience, and D rations were edible last resorts, then field kitchens were the closest thing to comfort food, warm, familiar, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as mobile kitchens or misery wagons, were pulled behind vehicles, or horses. The military's version of gourmet to-go, these units served up vats of stew, beans, gravy-like substances, and enough coffee to fuel a battalion. Meals were served cafeteria-style. Soldiers lined up with their trusty metal mess kits, often looking like leftover lab equipment, hoping the guy ahead didn't get the last scoop of whatever vaguely meat-based option was available. The menu varied by region. In Europe, you might get cream-chipped beef on toast, commonly nicknamed SOS, or stuff on a shingle, with a cruder alternative. In the Pacific, it might be rice and bits of hot dog floating in broth. But the coffee was sacred, strong, bitter, and brewed in bulk. Soldiers drank it any way they could, as long as it kept them awake and irritated. The best part of the field kitchen? The smell. It meant food was near. The worst part? Pretty much everything else. Meals were eaten outside, often in mud, snow, or pouring rain. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the ground. No utensils, no ambiance. Just you, a friend, and a tin of mystery meat possibly older than your CO. Still, when it was hot and somewhat chewable, field kitchen meals felt like a gift. No frills, no flair, but in a world of chaos, it was the closest thing to normalcy. At the beginning of WWII, German troops entered the field with something rare in warfare: food that resembled real meals. Early in the war, the Wehrmacht ration was downright generous compared to what most armies offered. Soldiers carried rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, ersatz coffee, which we'll cover later, with the scorn it deserves. Each soldier was responsible for carrying a couple of days' worth of food, a decent plan until you factored in rifles, ammo, grenades, and the constant threat of frostbite. German military rations were originally based on the principle of 3 hot meals a day, supported by field kitchens that followed units like slightly overburdened food trucks. Breakfast might consist of dark rye bread with butter or jam, paired with a roasted acorn coffee substitute. Lunch included canned meat, cheese, and possibly a few boiled potatoes. Dinner, assuming you weren't under artillery fire, was typically soup or stew made from whatever ingredients could be gathered that morning. Sausages, especially varieties like Mettwurst and Leberwurst, were staples, easy to transport, protein-rich, and somewhat comforting. But in sealed tins, they emitted a strong smell, blending with sweat and rust to create the signature aroma of the trenches. Bread was central to the German experience. Real, quality bread. Soldiers often missed it more than the comfort of a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran even called ration bread the only softness in an otherwise brutal war. Field kitchens worked hard to deliver hot stews, boiled meats, and dumplings. During this early phase, morale was high, bellies were mostly full, and German efficiency appeared unbeatable. But there's Alwa. Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with a question that's often overlooked in the chaos of tanks, trenches, and global warfare. What did World War II soldiers actually eat? From American K-rations to German ersatz, spread, Soviet cabbage soup, to Japanese rice balls, tonight we're unpacking history, one can of corned beef at a time. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who's tuning in across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that steady hum, and let's settle into tonight's journey together. Before a single shot was fired or a tank rolled across Europe, before planes screamed overhead, every military faced one simple but essential challenge: feeding its troops without making them sick in the process. Let's face it, when we think about WWII, we usually imagine epic battles, courage, and old newsreels. But how often do we wonder whether the guys storming the beach at Normandy had breakfast, and what that meal actually was? Spoiler: it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of soldiers across multiple continents wasn't just a cooking challenge, it was a logistical mess, often with a side of dysentery. Rations needed to be portable, shelf-stable, inexpensive, and ideally not bring you to tears after eating. Taste came in far behind other priorities, somewhere between won't explode if dropped and won't attract rats. Different countries tackled the problem differently. The US leaned on science, producing compact little boxes of hope known as K-rations. Germany initially issued hearty fare, meat, rye bread, then gradually downgraded to something that felt more like punishment in a can. Britain held on to tea like it was the last thread keeping the empire intact. Perhaps it was. The Soviets boiled cabbage with the reverence of a ritual. And the Japanese? They were often expected to travel light, survive on rice balls, and keep fighting. Food was more than sustenance, it was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold can of greasy meat could wreck them. Some soldiers grew oddly attached to their rations. Others vowed never to eat crackers again. Many didn't dream of glory. They dreamt of butter, fresh bread, and meals that didn't come in brown packaging. While generals strategized in war rooms, foot soldiers were in trenches, trading chocolate for cigarettes and hoping their bunkmates didn't snore through mess call. So tonight, we're not discussing who won which battle. We're exploring spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the unspoken war between soldiers and whatever lurked inside those ration tins. Because if there's one constant in warfare, it's this. Everyone has to eat, even when the food fights back. Picture this. You're a U.S. soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, dodged bullets, and haven't seen indoor plumbing in weeks. Your stomach is louder than enemy artillery. What's on the menu? The K-ration, a compact, calorie-dense cardboard package clearly designed by someone who never had to eat it. The K-ration came in 3 separate boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each was about the size of a brick, and sometimes just as pleasant to chew. These meals offered just enough nutrition to count as food, while mentally preparing you for whatever came next. Breakfast started strong, with a can labeled ham and eggs that resembled neither. Imagine the texture of Spam mixed with drywall. Add in rock-solid crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade, and, you guessed it, gum and cigarettes. Because nothing says good morning like nicotine. And yes, a single sheet of toilet paper. And so use wisely. Lunch didn't offer much of a reprieve. Maybe you'd get cheese spread, more chemical than cheese, another round of teeth-testing crackers, and a chocolate bar dense enough to qualify as battlefield equipment. No spoon? No problem. You'd improvise with a knife, a stick, or raw frustration. Dinner featured meat and beans, though the appearance was closer to a crime scene. More crackers, more gum, and maybe, if fortune favored you, a tiny fruit bar that tasted like someone had whispered apple near a block of sawdust. Despite the flavor, K-rations were nutritional workhorses, 3,000 calories a day packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough seasoning to avoid total despair. Troops swapped components like seasoned inmates, chocolate for cigarettes, cheese for anything else, and always trying to dodge the trauma of the ham and eggs. But every now and then, there it was, a real Hershey bar, actual chocolate, a bite of home. That alone made the rest of the experience tolerable. So yes, K-rations were dry, boxy, and tasted vaguely like regret, but they kept the troops going, one questionable meat product at a time. Now, if K-rations were survival food, the D-ration was something else entirely, more survival threat, disguised as dessert. At first glance, the D-ration looked like a chocolate bar. It was packaged like a chocolate bar. It was issued as a chocolate bar. That's where the illusion ended. This wasn't your comforting candy bar experience. The D-ration was designed alongside the U.S. Army with 3 goals. 1, don't melt. 2, last forever. And 3, taste awful enough that no one would eat it unless absolutely necessary. It was about the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to deflect small arms fire. Soldiers claimed it stopped bullets, or at least their digestive systems. Its ingredients were technically edible: chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and cocoa fat. The result: a brown brick that doubled as either a meal or emergency construction material. Such a harsh design, because these bars had to survive heat, cold, rain, sand, without becoming mush. And the military intentionally made them unappealing to discourage casual snacking. Mission very much accomplished. So hard it could break teeth. Many troops tried shaving it into hot drinks. Others just stared at it, baffled. Some legends say it was used as a hammer. But at 600 calories per bar, it could technically sustain a man through a day of fighting. Technically. If you were trapped behind enemy lines or stuck in a foxhole with only bad decisions for company, the D-ration could keep you alive. Happy? Not quite. Eventually, the army realized that chocolate doubling as brickwork wasn't helping morale. Later versions were a little softer, a bit more palatable. But by then, the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same fondness as a root canal. So next time someone says chocolate fixes everything, tell them about the D-ration, the bar that proved otherwise. If K-rations were the military's idea of convenience, and D-rations were edible last resorts, then field kitchens were the closest thing to comfort food, warm, familiar, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as mobile kitchens or misery wagons, were pulled behind vehicles, or horses. The military's version of gourmet to go, these units served up vats of stew, beans, gravy-like substances, and enough coffee to fuel a battalion. Meals were served cafeteria style. Soldiers lined up with their trusty metal mess kits, often looking like leftover lab equipment, hoping the guy ahead didn't get the last scoop of whatever vaguely meat-based option was available. The menu varied by region. In Europe, you might get cream-chipped beef on toast, commonly nicknamed SOS, or stuff on a shingle, with a cruder alternative. In the Pacific, it might be rice and bits of hot dog floating in broth. But the coffee was sacred, strong, bitter, and brewed in bulk. Soldiers drank it any way they could, as long as it kept them awake and irritated. The best part of the field kitchen? The smell. It meant food was near. The worst part? Pretty much everything else. Meals were eaten outside, often in mud, snow, or pouring rain. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the ground. No utensils, no ambiance. Just you, a friend, and a tin of mystery meat possibly older than your CO. Still, when it was hot and somewhat chewable, field kitchen meals felt like a gift. No frills, no flair, but in a world of chaos, it was the closest thing to normalcy. At the beginning of WWII, German troops entered the field with something rare in warfare: food that resembled real meals. Early in the war, the Wehrmacht ration was downright generous compared to what most armies offered. Soldiers carried rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, ersatz coffee, which we'll cover later, with the scorn it deserves. Each soldier was responsible for carrying a couple of days' worth of food, a decent plan until you factored in rifles, ammo, grenades, and the constant threat of frostbite. German military rations were originally based on the principle of 3 hot meals a day, supported by field kitchens that followed units like slightly overburdened food trucks. Breakfast might consist of dark rye bread with butter or jam, paired with a roasted acorn coffee substitute. Lunch included canned meat, cheese, and possibly a few boiled potatoes. Dinner, assuming you weren't under artillery fire, was typically soup or stew made from whatever ingredients could be gathered that morning. Sausages, especially varieties like Mettwurst and Leberwurst, were staples, easy to transport, protein-rich, and somewhat comforting. But in sealed tins, they emitted a strong smell, blending with sweat and rust to create the signature aroma of the trenches. Bread was central to the German experience. Real, quality bread. Soldiers often missed it more than the comfort of a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran even called ration bread the only softness in an otherwise brutal war. Field kitchens worked hard to deliver hot stews, boiled meats, and dumplings. During this early phase, morale was high, bellies were mostly full, and German efficiency appeared unbeatable. But there's all war. Tinned food was both salvation and punishment. It lasted forever, but opening it required muscle, tools, and sometimes prayer. Troops formed passionate opinions about tin designs, especially the ones with those cursed key rolls. When something fresh arrived, an egg, a tomato, a loaf of bread, it was either cause for celebration or suspicion. One soldier famously stared at a fresh tomato for an hour before deciding to keep it as a pet. Despite rationing, bland meals, and biscuit-induced dental trauma, British troops stayed composed. They complained with class, joked about digestion, and carried on, ideally with a cuppa in hand. If the American soldier had food, the German had order, and the Brit had tea. Then the Japanese soldier had rice, and an unbelievable tolerance for suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army prized endurance. Soldiers were taught that denying comfort was a virtue, and that hunger was part of duty, which was convenient because many were constantly starving. The Standard Japanese field ration barely qualified as a meal. It usually contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, soy sauce concentrate, and maybe a few hard candies. Culturally familiar, yes, but out in the field, completely inadequate. Troops began their missions with tidy wax paper rations in bento-style tins, neat and prepared until they hit the jungle. In New Guinea, Burma and Guadalcanal, humidity turned rice into paste, rats tore into supplies, and fish spoiled faster than hope. Japan's supply lines, to be generous, were a mess, bombed, blocked, or simply non-existent. Many units went days or weeks with barely a handful of rice to split. Soldiers resorted to foraging, raiding villages, or sampling jungle plants, with effects ranging from slightly nutritious to hallucinate, then collapse. Some even hunted lizards, bugs, and rats. One soldier said they made soup from grass and boiled boots just to quiet their stomachs. To their credit, or perhaps horror, Japanese soldiers rarely complained. They believed hardship was heroic. Starving, noble, barefoot, glorious, rice infested with bugs, extra protein, miso paste and powdered green tea were rare treasures. A spoonful of miso could lift spirits, a pinch of salt could cause tears. Overall, calories were low, hardship was high, and morale came not from food, but from sheer mental fortitude. Japanese troops weren't just underfed, they were conditioned to accept it. And somehow they kept fighting, not because of what was in their stomachs, but because of what was instilled in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific were green, but the food situation was grim, and green on the horizon like a tropical paradise, if you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the constant scent of decay. But for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of nourishment. It was a humid, hostile trap. Supply lines across the Pacific were notoriously unreliable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, and enemy ambushes made every delivery of rice, beans, or salted fish a miracle. And when those supplies didn't arrive, the jungle didn't help. Many Japanese units were cut off from supply routes for weeks at a time. They were forced to survive off the land. A problem, since the land had no idea how to help. The jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but weren't, animals that were edible but too fast, and insects that were not only inedible but aggressively hostile. Rations spoiled quickly, cans rusted shut, rice grew mold faster than a fire could be built. One soldier in Guadalcanal wrote, "Everything here is wet, even my appetite is damp." When they were lucky, they ate boiled roots, wild fruit, frogs, or jungle fowl, if they caught one. When unlucky, tree bark, shoe leather, rotting palm stems, or water laced with despair. There are accounts of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times to squeeze out every bit of nutrition. Others fermented leftovers into a starchy, half-dead gruel nicknamed jungle glue. Then there were the darker stories, whispers of cannibalism among starving units, especially during prolonged sieges. It wasn't common, but it did happen. Men pushed to the edge by isolation, war, and the emptiness gnawing at their stomachs. If anything strips away the romantic view of the Pacific theater, it's that bleak reality. Disease followed close behind hunger. Malaria, dysentery, dengue, fever, all worsened by malnutrition. Many soldiers didn't fall to bullets, but to slow, invisible breakdowns. The jungle didn't care which side you were on. It didn't feed you. It didn't protect you. It just waited for you to tire, then consumed you. War destroys cities, but it also inspires culinary improvisation by desperate soldiers armed with bayonets and a single can of Spam. Across every front, soldiers didn't just eat rations, they adapted them. They traded, reworked, crushed, fried, and occasionally treated them like science experiments. Food was fuel, yes, but also distraction and sometimes morale. American GIs mixed K-ration crackers with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, frying the mixture over small fires. The result was miserable but warm. Canned cheese melted into beans, became trench fondue. Spam was fried and stuffed into biscuits to form the world's saddest sandwich. Even chewing gum got reimagined, used to patch canteens or bribe a comrade for a cigarette. British troops armed with heart-stoppingly dense biscuits and mystical jars of jam made jam buddy sandwiches by crushing biscuits together until their teeth gave up. One North African squad mixed bully beef with dried fruit and called it Desert Delight. Another just called their nightly stew stuff because even the cook didn't know what was in it anymore. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers used shell casings as soup pots, boiled cabbage in helmets, and roasted anything with legs. One stolen German sausage had to be defended by 3 men. Even the Japanese, short on supplies, made do, refrying rice with pickled vegetables into onigiri-like cakes and hoarding dried seaweed to flavor water when nothing else remained. These meals weren't gourmet. They were field experiments. Improvised. Dishes turned boredom into morale, scarcity into sufficiency. They made food slightly less terrifying, because when you're in a trench, jungle, or ruined house, your mess kit becomes your kitchen, your bayonet becomes your spatula, and your meal, a small miracle that you live to eat it. Long after the battles ended, long after the uniforms were stored and medals packed away, one memory stayed with WWII veterans. The food, or more precisely, the memory tied to the food. Rations were more than fuel. They framed moments of trauma, humor, grief, boredom, and hope. A bite of bully beef could bring back a French foxhole. The scent of cabbage soup recalled frozen trenches near Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just meat. It was a time capsule. Many remembered their meals with grim humor. American vets joked about D-rations like they were enemies. British soldiers shared tales of trading hardtack with locals, only to be mocked. A Soviet veteran said he avoided bread for years, not out of dislike, but because it felt sacred. Food marked war's boundaries. A fresh apple meant farmland nearby, maybe safety. A hot stew meant survival for one more day. Even bitter coffee meant someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were care packages, morale-lifting boxes from home, chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, and handwritten notes nestled beside cookies. These weren't just sweets. They were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers hoarded them, others shared. A few rationed them, stretching hope across weeks of misery. Some flavors never faded. Veterans joked about tasting the metal of ration tins decades later. One GI claimed he could still smell Spam when it rained. Another said his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs. Because in war, eating isn't just physical. It's an act of staying human amid madness. Each meal, however bland or bizarre, became part of them. So next time you heat a snack in the microwave, think of those soldiers, cooking with bayonets, firewood, and pure grit. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste never really left. The ink was barely dry on the US Constitution when the young republic faced its first major crisis. Not from foreign invaders or political infighting, but from something much stronger: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War had buried the new nation in debt, and President George Washington, along with Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, needed a plan. Hamilton, always the strategist, proposed a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, whiskey being the most common. To urban elites and coastal merchants, the idea seemed fair, but to the western frontier, it felt like an insult, a blow from a powdered wig aristocrat. Out west, in places like Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a currency. Farmers converted excess grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, preserve longer, and brought in more profit than raw crops. Trading whiskey was everyday business. So when the government began taxing it, many frontier residents saw it not as policy, but betrayal. It reminded them of the distant authority they'd just fought to escape. Worse, the tax itself seemed designed to punish small producers. Large distilleries could pay a flat annual fee. Smaller operations had to pay per gallon, meaning they paid more relative to their output. And when tax collectors started riding in to enforce the law, tensions grew. At first, resistance was mild. Inspectors were threatened. Tax papers burned. Revenue officers politely told to leave. But that politeness quickly turned violent. Tar and feathering returned. Homes were attacked. In one case, a collector was stripped, tied to a tree, and had his hair cut off. Backwoods justice with a splash of rage, and Washington noticed he watched. By 1792, the whiskey tax had become toxic. In the frontier regions of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, resistance turned coordinated. Tax collectors heard two sounds regularly, breaking windows and gunshots. Western Pennsylvania became ground zero for open rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins where muskets leaned against barrels of homemade whiskey. These weren't random outbursts. These were organized. Locals formed militias. They passed resolutions against the tax. Some boycotted anyone who paid it. It was equal parts protest, organized crime, and Appalachian bootlegging. By 1793, violence escalated. Tax officials and their allies were ambushed and whipped. One man was paraded through town with a sign reading, "Coward," around his neck. Think Boston Tea Party, but angrier and smellier. Federal courts issued summonses to bring the rebels to justice, but delivering them was nearly impossible. In many places, sheriffs were either indifferent or sympathetic. Law was unraveling. Washington, normally composed, began to lose patience. The Whiskey Rebellion was no longer just a tax issue, it was threatening the legitimacy of federal authority. If the government couldn't enforce its own laws, what was the Constitution worth? Still, Washington held back. He sent commissioners to negotiate. But trying to reason with rebels was like serving tea in a saloon brawl. The rebels had formed. Committees held conventions and in some cases considered secession. They saw themselves not as criminals, but patriots resisting tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hawk, whispered reminders. "You're going to let them walk all over the Constitution after everything we fought for." And with that, Washington made a choice, one that would shock the rebels and set a precedent for the federal government's authority. He raised a federal army against his own citizens. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had evolved beyond rural outrage. It was now a direct threat to federal authority. George Washington, who had once led a revolution against a monarchy, found himself in the unusual position of mobilizing an army against Americans, the very people he had helped liberate. And this was no modest militia. Washington summoned over 12,000 troops, nearly triple the number he had commanded at the Battle of Trenton. The force drew from state militias in Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. While some troops volunteered, others were essentially compelled into service. It marked the largest federal military deployment in U.S. history to that point. Not against a foreign enemy, but to suppress angry farmers armed with pitchforks and illegal stills. Alexander Hamilton, always one for theatrical displays, accompanied the troops like a powdered-wig general eager for action. He was exhilarated. This was his opportunity to prove that the federal government had strength and was willing to use it. Washington, though more cautious, understood the implications. The rebellion wasn't just about untaxed liquor. It tested whether the United States could uphold law and order, if tax collectors could be driven off without repercussions, if Congress could be ignored with impunity, then the Constitution would lose its authority. So, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president led troops into the field. Picture it. The most iconic figure in the country, riding west through the Allegheny Mountains, not to rally a revolution, but to suppress one. His presence sent a stern message. Rebellion would be met not with debate, but with discipline. But when the army reached the rebellious heart of western Pennsylvania, the confrontation fizzled. Those who had talked tough in taverns and set fire to tax collectors' homes suddenly remembered more pressing duties. Leaders disappeared. Others fled into the woods or claimed ignorance. There would be no major battle, no dramatic showdown. The army had marched for miles to confront a rebellion that quietly evaporated. Still, Washington's message was unmistakable. Federal law would be enforced. With no resistance to meet them, the troops returned home, and so did Washington. What remained was the legal aftermath: arrests, trials, and justice according to federal standards. A few individuals were captured, not the key agitators, most of whom had slipped away, but those unfortunate enough to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. 20 men were sent to Philadelphia for trial on charges of treason, yet the proceedings did not unfold as Hamilton had envisioned. The evidence was weak, witnesses reluctant, and local juries hesitant to condemn their neighbors to death. The end, only 2 were convicted, and even those verdicts were met with skepticism. These weren't violent radicals. They were impoverished farmers who had made poor choices. Washington, familiar with rebellion himself, opted for clemency over punishment. To the surprise of some and the reassurance of others, he pardoned both men. His message was clear. The government would uphold the law, but it would not become oppressive. This show of mercy proved as consequential as the show of strength. Washington demonstrated federal authority, but he also emphasized justice. The new government would not crush its people like a monarchy. It would lead through a combination of law and fairness. Hamilton, however, was frustrated. He had hoped for a more severe outcome. To him, the rebellion confirmed his distrust of the general population, especially with alcohol involved. But Washington saw the broader implications. True legitimacy didn't come from force alone. It came from showing the Republic could wield power responsibly. The rebellion had ended, but the precedent would echo for generations. The federal government had passed its first major test and held firm. Still, deeper questions lingered. Would future presidents strike the same balance? Would power always be tempered by mercy? And was this merely the end of one rebellion or the start of many? The soldiers went home. The rebels were pardoned, but the political aftershocks would last for years. While the government had proven it could enforce its laws, the event also deepened existing political divides. At its core, the rebellion revealed 2 competing visions of America. On one side stood Hamilton and the Federalists, champions of order, commerce, and strong central authority. They saw the rebellion as proof that rural America required firm guidance. Opposing them were the Jeffersonian Republicans, who distrusted centralized power. They valued small farmers, local governance, and the spirit of resistance that had fueled the revolution. To them, the federal response wasn't justice, it was an overreaction. Sending 12,000 troops to deal with farmers fermenting corn mash seemed absurdly excessive. Thomas Jefferson, then vice president, didn't hide his disapproval. Privately, he called the federal march a monarchical adventure. He believed the show of force alienated the common man and pushed him toward the Republican cause. And indeed, something shifted. Out on the frontier, support for Jefferson surged. These weren't just angry farmers anymore. They were voters, frustrated at being treated like criminals over a tax they could scarcely afford. The rebellion failed militarily, but it succeeded in galvanizing opposition to Federalist policies. It accelerated the emergence of America's first political parties, sharpening the divide between those who favored a strong federal government and those who wanted more state control. A new kind of conflict began, not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, arguments, and ideology. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about taxation. It reflected deeper frustrations about power and class. To small farmers in western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax wasn't just burdensome, it symbolized everything they feared about centralized rule, that the government would favor wealthy elites at the expense of working people. Most rebels weren't criminals. Many were veterans of the Revolutionary War, men who had fought for a government they now felt had betrayed them. They came home to find themselves taxed, scrutinized, and left out of the political conversation. Eastern bankers and urban politicians made decisions that ignored the realities of frontier life. Political representation was skewed. Small producers felt punished, while wealthier distillers could afford legal protections and paperwork to avoid harassment. To many, it looked less like tax policy and more like economic oppression. Even how the law was enforced highlighted the imbalance. Wealthy distillers paid a flat fee, small operators got federal marshals and jail time. The optics were bad, and the resentment was real. In that sense, the rebellion was a warning. Class tension wasn't going away just because America had a constitution. If anything, the divide between affluent centers of power and struggling rural communities was built into the system. The Whiskey Rebellion was merely the first sign of that reality. Some of the most radical rebels even echoed the language of the French Revolution, which was unfolding at the same time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, such talk was dangerous. They feared it might spark a peristyle upheaval in the Ohio Valley. But to the rebels, these ideals weren't radical. They were promises already broken. Washington's decision to personally lead the army was both bold and unprecedented. At the time, many saw the presidency as a relatively symbolic role, a steady hand for a young government still finding its way. But Washington shattered that expectation. He was no passive figurehead. He was a forceful executor of federal law. For him, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about taxes or protests. It was a defining moment for the republic he helped create. If intimidation prevailed over legislation, the entire project could unravel. 13. And by personally leading troops into the mountains, Washington made it clear the federal system had the will to endure. When word spread that George Washington was personally heading west, many rebels quietly disappeared. Some were in disbelief. Washington had once symbolized freedom, and now he was mobilizing troops over a whiskey tax. But the strategy worked. Washington didn't need to fire a shot. His presence alone was enough to re-establish control. And he knew when to stop. Once the unrest subsided, he pulled back. He didn't occupy the area, didn't punish civilians, and didn't turn it into a public spectacle. He simply reminded the nation that the law wasn't optional. Still, not everyone approved. Critics from the Jeffersonian camp accused him of using the military to suppress valid political opposition. They portrayed the march as an overreach, an unnecessary display of federal force that could have gone terribly wrong. Even some Federalists were uneasy. What kind of precedent had been set? Nonetheless, the quick end to the rebellion allowed Washington to conclude his presidency with strength. He enforced the law without tyranny, demonstrated authority without cruelty. Yet, Washington knew this wouldn't be the last challenge to national unity, and next time it might not end as peacefully. Although the Whiskey Rebellion faded with little violence, its effects stretched far beyond the frontier. In hindsight, this conflict over liquor taxes became one of the first real tests of the U.S. Constitution. It established a critical precedent. The federal government not only had the authority to enforce its laws, but also the means to do so, even against violent resistance. Before this, the Constitution had been largely theoretical. The failures of the Articles of Confederation had revealed the dangers of a weak federal system. Now, under Washington's leadership, the new Constitution flexed its strength. But with that came unease. Many, especially in rural areas, started, viewing the federal government not as their representative, but as a remote elite disconnected from their reality. These were the same people who had once fought against British oppression. Now their discontent was aimed at power centers like Philadelphia and New York. Culturally, the rebellion became legend in Appalachia. Stories circulated of bold distillers resisting federal agents. Some were exaggerated, some idealized, but all carried a common message. Government won't always protect you, and sometimes action requires more than casting a vote. Sometimes it takes a still, a rifle, and a few determined neighbors. Meanwhile, as the new U.S. Capitol was being planned during the rebellion's aftermath, lawmakers were paying attention. The Whiskey Rebellion became a case study. Should future crises be met with rapid force followed by forgiveness? Or had this response set a dangerous example of federal overreach? Ironically, despite the rebellion's failure, the tax itself was ineffective. It cost a lot to enforce, was widely evaded, and became politically toxic. By the early 1800s under Jefferson, it was quietly repealed. The rebels had lost the immediate battle, but in a way, they had won the longer fight for public sentiment. The frontier remembered. So did the government, and future presidents would face their own versions of rebellion, large or small, with the memory of 1794 never far behind. A constant reminder that national order is fragile and always at risk of collapse. The Whiskey Rebellion might now seem like an odd footnote in early U.S. history, but its legacy is still felt today. It helped shape how Americans understand the Constitution, not as just words on paper, but as a living structure with real power. This was the first time federal law was enforced through military action, and it happened under the direct command of the first president, lending it significant weight. Presidents ever since, Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent ones deploying the National Guard, have followed the path first walked in 1794 by a president on horseback. At the same time, the rebellion introduced lasting skepticism into American political culture. Rural distrust of centralized power became a permanent feature of the national psyche. The rebellion didn't have to succeed. It simply confirmed fears that remote authorities could and would act when it suited them. That rural spirit of defiance persists in anti-tax protests, state sovereignty arguments, and the enduring American preference for local control. In essence, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance that never died. They fermented. Even whiskey itself carries a strange legacy. Far from being stigmatized, it became a symbol of resilience and independence. The very product that triggered a rebellion is now celebrated. American whiskey, especially bourbon and rye, embraces its rebellious roots. Distilleries bear the names of revolt leaders, bottles are styled to evoke frontier toughness, and slogans proudly challenge authority, sometimes with a wink at the IRS. More broadly, the rebellion offered a lasting lesson: how a nation responds to dissent defines its identity. Washington chose both enforcement and leniency. That mix, power guided by principle, became a foundation of the American ideal. Not always followed, but always referenced. So the next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it's not just alcohol in that glass. It's a story about power, protest, and a young country learning what it stood for. A toast to the rebellion that helped shape a nation. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon inscribed his now famous code onto a large basalt stele, a towering stone meant to inform his subjects and project divine justice. It remains one of the earliest recorded legal systems in human history, but within its 282 laws lies something just as enduring: the control of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman was not just a person, she was defined by her role: daughter, wife, widow, or mother. Each role came with its own legal expectations and consequences. Consider marriage. Women could be married off by their fathers, essentially transferred between households. Once married, they were expected to remain faithful. If a woman was accused of adultery, she and her alleged partner could be bound and tossed into a river. That's not symbolic. It's exactly what the text says. However, if her husband decided to spare her, the court usually respected his wishes, a grim form of mercy. Meanwhile, male infidelity was rarely punished. Hammurabi's code seemed unconcerned with men cheating. The contrast was clear. Female honor reflected family honor, while male honor was treated more loosely. Still, not all the laws were oppressive. Some offered notable protections, especially for widows. A widow could remain in her late husband's home and manage his property until her sons matured. If there were no sons, she might even inherit the estate herself. In that sense, the law acknowledged women's capacity for financial and legal authority, within the family structure at least. Divorce was also addressed. A woman could leave her husband for cruelty or neglect, but proving it was difficult. If she failed to convince the court, she risked being labeled a liar and punished accordingly. Justice was not blind, it just squinted harder when the accused wore a veil. So what can we learn from Hammurabi's code about women in ancient Babylon? They weren't invisible. On the contrary, they were clearly recognized, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected, but always within limits set by male-dominated structures. The law gave women a place, but rarely the power to shape it. Travel west from Babylon and forward in time, and you reach ancient Egypt. There, the concept of justice was embodied by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Compared to neighboring civilizations, Egypt offered surprisingly progressive legal rights for women, at least on paper. Egyptian women, regardless of wealth, had the legal ability to own property, inherit land, initiate divorce, and engage in contracts. These rights weren't just ceremonial, they were actively practiced, particularly in cities like Thebes and Memphis. Women could conduct business, lend money, and buy slaves or livestock. In essence, they were treated as independent legal actors, not simply extensions of their fathers or husbands. This autonomy was exceptional for its time. Women weren't excluded from temples or courts. Priestesses played key legal and spiritual roles. Some even worked as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom show women filing lawsuits against male relatives and winning, but there were limits. Legal freedom didn't erase social constraints. Most women still operated under the authority of a father or husband, and although they could own property, they were generally expected to pass it along through male heirs. The law might have said yes, but society often said not quite. Marriage in Egypt, while not religiously grounded, still had legal standing. Spouses could separate for reasons ranging from infertility to infidelity, or simply incompatibility. In ancient Egypt, divorce didn't carry much social stigma. Children typically stayed with the mother, who kept her dowry and often received more property. Though laws promised equal punishment regardless of gender, in practice, social status and connections mattered more. A noblewoman could escape consequences that would condemn a peasant woman, sometimes literally, to crocodiles. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not quite. But compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or classical Greece, it gave women something rare, the legal standing to act as individuals, not just as property. In a society ruled by pharaohs and gods, that was significant. In ancient India, the legal status of women was shaped by dharma, the moral and social order. Central to Hinduism, codified in texts like the Manusmriti or Laws of Manu, still exceptions existed. Some upper caste women were educated and could inherit property if there were no male heirs. In certain regions, particularly in the south, matrilineal traditions persisted. Women occasionally served as advisors, poets, or rulers. Though these cases were rare and often exceptional, divorce was uncommon and typically discouraged, though reasons like impotence, abuse, or abandonment were sometimes accepted. Still, men held more legal power to end a marriage. Punishments were gendered. A woman caught in adultery could be maimed or shunned, while a man of status might face only a fine. In essence, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in a dual narrative of reverence and control. Women were honored, but, like sacred idols, not like free individuals. They were respected but rarely empowered. When we think of ancient Greece, we think of democracy, philosophy, and theatre. But for women, the legal system wasn't about ideals, it was about exclusion. In classical Athens, women weren't considered full persons under the law. They were permanent legal minors under the guardianship of their closest male relative. Athenian. Women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They couldn't make contracts or even leave the house without male supervision. If the Code of Hammurabi subordinated women legally, Athens took it further. By systematically excluding them, marriage was more transaction than partnership. A woman's kyrios, typically her father or brother, arranged her marriage, transferring her along with land and dowry to her husband's household. Legally, she was a possession being exchanged. Paradoxically, her sexual fidelity was considered legally vital. A wife caught in adultery could be divorced on the spot, and her lover could be executed, no trial required. Meanwhile, her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal consequences. These double standards were built into the legal system. Women couldn't file for divorce, but if mistreated or abandoned, they could return to their father's home. Even then, any legal action had to be taken by a male guardian. In cases of rape or assault, the woman couldn't bring charges herself. Her kyrios had to act for her. There were outliers. Spartan women had more freedom. They could own land, be educated, and move about more freely. But Sparta was the exception. In most Greek city-states, a respectable woman's name was not to be mentioned in public. The ideal was modest, silent, and unseen. Yet within this legal invisibility, women endured. They raised families, ran households, and in rare instances, influenced public life from behind the legal curtain. Still, they weren't considered citizens. In a society that celebrated logic and liberty, those rights were reserved for men. Ancient. Rome's legal system was detailed, hierarchical, and highly pragmatic. Roman women weren't equals under the law. But compared to Greek women, they had more visibility and complexity in their legal standing. At birth, a Roman woman came under patria potestas, the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, the control could either transfer to her husband, manus marriage, or stay with her father's family, sine manu marriage. The latter became more common, allowing women to keep ties with their birth family and, in some cases, manage property independently. This shift created space for women, especially widows and wealthy daughters, to own land, run businesses, and sign contracts. While they couldn't vote or hold office, they could sue in court with male representation, act as guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law clearly defined ideal female behavior. The model woman was pudica, modest, faithful, and obedient. Under Augustus' moral reforms, adultery became a public crime. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, be exiled, or worse. Men, however, faced little consequence for infidelity. There were special roles. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, were the only women free from male guardianship. In exchange for 30 years of celibacy, they gained prestige, legal independence, and the rare power to pardon criminals. But breaking their vow meant being buried alive. Upper-class Roman matrons held notable social power. They influenced politics through their families, arranged marriages, and shaped public mourning. The law recognized their status with property, rights and symbolic guardianship structures like tutela, which by the imperial period was often only nominal. So while Roman women lived within legal constraints, those bars left some room to move, especially for the elite. They weren't free, but neither were they silent. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't just civic, it was sacred. Found in the Torah and interpreted by rabbis, these religious laws governed all aspects of life, including women's roles. Family was the legal foundation, with women expected to be the household's spiritual and moral anchor, but always under male leadership. Fathers arranged marriages, husbands led households, and sons inherited land. Daughters married out, bringing dowries but often receiving no inheritance unless no sons existed. Yet women weren't entirely powerless. The ketubah, a marriage contract, guaranteed financial support and set expectations for the marriage. If a husband failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, the wife could seek divorce, a rare right in the ancient world. Still, she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or male relative had to act on her behalf. Adultery laws were harsh. A married woman caught cheating could be stoned to death. A man caught with a married woman faced the same. But if the woman was unmarried or enslaved, the consequences were inconsistent, often fines or forced marriage, depending on status. Rape laws typically required the man to pay a fine and marry the victim, an outcome modern readers rightly find troubling. Ritual purity laws also influenced how women were treated. During menstruation or after childbirth, they were deemed ritually impure and excluded from certain activities. These restrictions framed women as symbolically other, not sinful, but distinctly separate. Still, the Hebrew Bible highlights influential women. Deborah, a judge, Ruth, a widowed foreigner navigating inheritance law, and Esther, who defied royal law to save her people. These figures were rare, but they show that courage, wisdom, and faith could occasionally transcend legal limits. WWII, a Achaemenid empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, governed a vast, diverse population, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and more. Within this immense empire, Persian law operated with a notable level of tolerance. When word spread that George Washington himself was heading west, many rebels quickly vanished into the countryside. Some found it hard to believe this was the very hero of liberty, now advancing against citizens over a whiskey tax. But the gamble worked. Washington didn't have to fire a single shot. His presence alone brought stability, and he knew when to pull back. Once the rebellion faded, he stepped away. He didn't occupy the region, punish the general population, or stage a dramatic show of justice. He simply sent a clear message: the law isn't optional. Still, not everyone approved. Critics, particularly those aligned with Jefferson, saw it as an overreach, military pressure used to silence political dissent. They called the march an overreaction, a risky flex of federal power that could have spiraled quickly. Even some Federalists were uneasy. What precedent had just been set? Nonetheless, the rebellion's quick resolution let Washington end his presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming oppressive. He showed authority without excess. Yet privately, Washington knew that this would not be the last test of national unity, and that future challenges might not resolve so peacefully. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended quietly, its effects spread widely, politically, legally, and culturally. In hindsight, this obscure conflict over distilled spirits became one of the earliest and most important constitutional stress tests in American history. First, it established a vital precedent. The federal government had both the authority and the capacity to enforce its laws, even against violent defiance. Until then, the Constitution had largely been an idea on paper. The failure of the Articles of Confederation had exposed the dangers of a weak central government. But now, with Washington's intervention, the new system proved it had strength, yet with power came growing unease. Many, especially in rural areas, began to view the federal government not as their representative, but as a faraway elite, disconnected from frontier life. The same people who once hailed the revolution now murmured about new forms of tyranny, this time from Philadelphia or New York, not London. Culturally, the rebellion became folklore in the Appalachian backcountry. Tales circulated about brave distillers standing up to federal officers. Some stories were embellished, others romanticized, but they all echoed a common message. The government may not always be on your side, and sometimes change demands more than just casting a vote. Sometimes it takes a still, a rifle, and a determined group of locals. Meanwhile, in the soon-to-be-built capital of Washington, D.C., planned during the aftermath of the uprising, leaders took careful notes. The Whiskey Rebellion would become a reference point every time domestic unrest threatened the Republic. Was it a model of swift federal response, followed by restraint, or a troubling sign of executive overreach? And then, of course, there was the whiskey. Ironically, even though the rebellion was suppressed, the tax itself never truly succeeded. It was costly to enforce, frequently ignored, and politically damaging. By the early 1800s, under President Jefferson, it was quietly repealed. The rebels may have lost the confrontation, but in a way, they won the broader public opinion. The frontier remembered, and so did the government. Future presidents would face their own uprisings, big and small, with the shadow of 1794 looming. Behind them, a reminder that order is fragile, and the nation always risks reaching a boiling point. Today, the Whiskey Rebellion might seem like a minor historical event, a quirky chapter in early American history, but its influence endures. Drifting like steam off a still, it continues to shape ideas about presidential power and rural defiance. It showed Americans that the Constitution wasn't just symbolic, it had enforcement behind it. This was the first time the federal government used military force to uphold domestic law, and that it happened under George Washington's direct leadership gave it historical weight. Every president since, Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent leaders deploying the National Guard, can trace their authority in part back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also planted lasting skepticism toward centralized authority. That suspicion, born on the frontier, has become embedded in the American political character. Despite the rebellion's failure, it confirmed what many feared, that distant leaders could and would exert control when it suited them. That defiant spirit still echoes today in anti-tax movements, states' rights debates, and the enduring American preference for local power over federal reach. In short, the rebellion didn't vanish, it fermented, and so did the whiskey. Far from being vilified, it became a symbol of resilience and self-reliance. The very substance that triggered the rebellion is now celebrated in bars and distilleries as a proud emblem of American grit. The modern whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears that rebellious legacy with pride. Some brands are named after rebellion leaders. Their labels invoke frontier life. Their slogans practically dare the taxman to try again. And finally, the Whiskey Rebellion offered a young nation a lasting lesson. How it responds to dissent defines its values. Washington chose to act with both firmness and forgiveness. That balance, strength tempered by principle, became a foundational aspect of the American ideal. It's not always honored, but it's often remembered. So the next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it's not just alcohol in that bottle. It's the story of power, protest, and a republic figuring out what it wanted to become. Cheers to the rebellion that helped shape a nation. Ancient legal systems and women's rights. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon carved his famed code into a towering basalt stele, a symbol of divine justice and legal order. Among its 282 laws were detailed rules not just about crime and punishment, but about women's roles. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't simply an individual, she was defined by her role: daughter, wife, widow, or mother. Each identity came with specific expectations and consequences. Take marriage, for example. Fathers arranged marriages, effectively transferring women between households. Once married, a woman was expected to be loyal. If accused of adultery, she and her partner could be bound and thrown into a river, literally, not metaphorically. Still, if her husband chose to pardon her, courts often went along. Harsh justice, with a grim hint of sentiment. If a man cheated, however, there was little outrage. Male infidelity wasn't taken seriously. The contrast was clear. A woman's. Virtue was tied to family honor. A man's reputation had more leeway. Not all laws were oppressive, though. Some granted women protection, especially widows. A widow could stay in her husband's home and manage his property until her sons matured. If there were no sons, she might inherit directly. In that way, the code acknowledged women's ability to handle financial matters, but always within the family structure. Divorce laws also existed. A woman could leave a cruel or neglectful husband, but proving it was difficult. If her claims didn't hold up, she could be punished as a liar. Justice wasn't blind, it just squinted harder. When women stood trial, so what does Hammurabi's code reveal about Babylonian women? They weren't ignored, they were seen, labeled, judged, and sometimes protected, but they were always regulated. Law gave them a place, but rarely control over it. Travel westward a few hundred miles and forward several centuries, and you'll reach ancient Egypt, a civilization where justice was personified by Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. Compared to their neighbors, Egyptians had relatively progressive views on women's legal rights. At least on paper. Egyptian women could own property, inherit land, sue or be sued, and initiate divorce. These weren't theoretical rights. They were practiced, especially in cities like Thebes and Memphis. Women signed contracts, acted as witnesses, and drafted wills. They ran businesses, loaned money, and purchased slaves or livestock. Legally, they were seen as individuals, not just extensions of their husbands. Women weren't barred from religious or legal roles either. Priestesses had formal authority, and some even served as scribes or judges. New Kingdom records show women filing and winning lawsuits against male relatives, but legal rights didn't always translate into social freedom. Most women still answered to a male head of household, and while they could inherit land, they were usually expected to pass it down through sons. The law may have said yes, but society often said not quite. Marriage wasn't religious in Egypt, but it was legally binding. Divorce was acceptable for various reasons: infidelity, infertility, even personal conflict. Divorced women typically retained their dowry and custody of children, often receiving additional property. In theory, punishment was equal, regardless of gender. In practice, wealth and status played a bigger role. A noble woman might escape penalties that would doom a peasant woman, sometimes to death by crocodile. So was ancient Egypt a paradise for women? Not quite. But compared to Mesopotamia or later Greece, it gave women something rare: legal personhood. In a world ruled by gods and kings, that mattered. In ancient India, women's legal status was shaped by dharma, the social and moral order. Central to Hindu philosophy, Codified in texts like the laws of Manu, Manusmriti, this system offered women respect and protection, but only if they stayed within strict boundaries. Compiled between 200 BCE and 200 CE, the Manusmriti had a lot to say about women, and much of it was inconsistent. One line claimed that the gods rejoice where women are honored. Another insisted a woman must never act independently. The tone fluctuated between reverence and restriction. Women were expected to live under male guardianship, fathers in childhood, husbands in marriage, sons in widowhood. This legal hierarchy wasn't just cultural, it was encoded into law. Independence wasn't ideal, obedience was. Marriage laws were rigid. A woman's duty was to marry, bear sons, and serve her husband faithfully. Widow remarriage was rare, often banned depending on caste or era. Sati, the controversial practice of widows self-immolating on their husbands' pyres, was not mandated by the Manusmriti, but it wasn't condemned either. In some regions, it was morally endorsed. Still, there were exceptions. Elite women sometimes received education and could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. In southern India, matrilineal traditions occasionally endured. Some women became poets, advisors, even rulers, though these cases were rare and exceptional. Divorce was generally discouraged. Some forms, due to cruelty, impotence, or abandonment, were legally recognized, but men had greater freedom to dissolve marriages. Punishments for women were often more severe. Adulterous women could be publicly shamed, disfigured, or exiled. In some, ancient Indian law didn't ignore women. It defined them. It gave them roles, duties, and certain protections, but their autonomy was always conditional. They were part of the legal world, but rarely its. Authors: a man of high status in ancient Hindu society might receive only a fine or a mild punishment for misconduct. Hindu law cloaked women in both reverence and restriction, honored, but more like sacred statues in temples than independent citizens. Women were respected, but rarely given real power. When we picture ancient Greece, we often think of democracy, philosophy, and theatre. But for women, especially in classical Athens, the legal system prioritized exclusion over equality. Women were legally classified as permanent minors, dependent on their closest male relative throughout their lives. In Athenian law, women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They couldn't enter contracts or even leave the house without a male chaperone. If Hammurabi's code made women legally secondary, Athens refined the art of keeping them entirely excluded. Marriage resembled a transaction more than a partnership. A woman's kurios, typically her father or brother, arranged her marriage, transferring her to her husband, along with a dowry and sometimes land. In legal terms, she was treated like property passed from one man to another. Ironically, while she lacked legal power, her fidelity was a legal matter of great importance. If she committed adultery, her husband could divorce her instantly, and the man involved could be executed without a trial. Meanwhile, husbands could freely sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal consequence. These double standards weren't anomalies. They were built into the legal framework. A woman couldn't initiate divorce. She could return to her father's home if abandoned or mistreated, but any legal process had to be initiated by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, the woman could not bring charges herself. Her kurios had to act for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women had more autonomy. They could own land, receive education, and move freely. But Spartan women were outliers. In most city-states, a woman's name wasn't supposed to be spoken in public. The ideal was for her to be modest, quiet, and largely invisible. Yet, women endured. They raised families, managed households, and in rare cases, held influence behind the legal curtain. But in official records, they were not citizens, merely background figures in a system that celebrated liberty for men only. In ancient Rome, law was structured, hierarchical, and practical. Roman women were far from equal, but they held more visibility and legal nuance than their Greek counterparts. From birth, a Roman woman was under the patria potestas, the absolute authority of her father. After marriage, this control either shifted to her husband, manus marriage, or remained with her birth family, sine manu marriage. The latter became more common over time, enabling women to maintain ties to their original families and, in some cases, own property or manage assets. This development allowed women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, run businesses, and sign contracts. Though they couldn't vote or hold office, they could participate in court with a male sponsor, act as guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law was clear about its expectations. The ideal woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once considered a private issue, became a public offense under Augustus's reforms. A guilty woman could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. In contrast, male infidelity remained legally tolerated. There were rare exceptions. Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, were the only women free from male guardianship. In return for 30 years of celibacy, they gained prestige, legal independence, and the unique right to pardon prisoners. But if they broke their vow, they were buried alive. Sacred roles carried severe risks. Elite Roman women or matrons held considerable social influence. They shaped politics through family networks, arranged marriages, and led public mourning rituals. Legal systems reflected their elevated status through property rights and mechanisms like tutela, a form of male guardianship that became largely symbolic by the imperial period. Roman women lived within constraints, but the legal structure gave them just enough room to move, especially those with wealth or status. They weren't free, but they weren't completely voiceless either. In ancient Hebrew society, law was not just a civic system. It was divine commandment, rooted in the Torah and interpreted by rabbis. These religious laws shaped every area of life, including the status of women. Women were seen as vital to the household's moral and spiritual framework, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages, husbands headed families, and sons inherited land. Daughters often married out with dowries and had limited inheritance rights unless there were no sons, yet women weren't entirely without protections. The ketubah, a marriage contract, ensured some financial security and laid out marital responsibilities. If a husband failed to provide essentials, food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could pursue divorce, though she couldn't file for it directly. A rabbinic court or male relative could intervene on her behalf. Adultery laws were harsh. A married woman caught cheating could be stoned. A man with a married woman faced the same penalty. But the rules changed depending on social status. Unmarried or enslaved women saw different outcomes, often involving fines or forced marriage. In cases of rape, the law mandated fines and marriage to the victim, a concept troubling by today's standards. Ritual purity laws also defined women's roles. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered impure and excluded from religious practices and contact, reinforcing the notion of symbolic separateness rather than sinfulness. Nonetheless, the Hebrew Bible highlights powerful female figures: Deborah, a judge; Ruth, a foreign widow who navigated inheritance law; and Esther, who defied royal protocol to save her people. These women were exceptions, but they show that faith, courage, and intelligence could carve out space even within strict systems. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a diverse population, from Babylonians to Egyptians to Greeks. Persian law was pragmatic and relatively tolerant, extending some notable legal recognition to women. Though not codified like Hammurabi's laws, Persian legal records and inscriptions show elite women held real authority. Royal women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus and mother of Xerxes, managed estates, issued orders, and appeared in official documents as landowners and decision-makers. Tablets from the Persepolis archives record women receiving rations, supervising, labor, and managing production. These weren't exceptions. High-ranking women near the royal family often had significant legal power over land and labor. Marriage laws in Persia combined local customs with central oversight. Women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land, sometimes more securely than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were protected, and women could reclaim them if a marriage ended. Divorce was allowed for both genders, though it often favored men unless abuse or infertility could be proven. Adultery, however, remained a capital offense, especially for women. Punishment varied by class. Noble women might face exile, servants could face execution. Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion, influenced these laws. While men and women had spiritual roles, ritual purity laws restricted contact during menstruation or childbirth, mirroring Hebrew and Hindu traditions. Persian law gave women a mix of freedom, reverence, and limitation. Status often determined. Legal voice, higher rank meant greater autonomy. In ancient China, law wasn't just about rules. It reflected Confucian ideals of order, duty, and hierarchy. For women, this meant living under a structure that emphasized family roles over individual rights. Early Chinese laws emerged during the Zhou dynasty, but the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, solidified them alongside Confucian teachings. Women were expected to follow the 3 obediences: obey father before marriage, husband during marriage, and sons in widowhood. These were not just moral codes, they informed legal expectations. Women had little legal standing. They couldn't hold office, seldom appeared in court independently, and were often denied inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. Though valued within households, the law viewed daughters as temporary. They would eventually marry out, taking a dowry. Marriage was both a legal and social alliance. Men could divorce wives for jealousy or illness, but not if the woman had no family to return to, had properly mourned his parents, or had borne him sons. Women could only request divorce in extreme cases, usually needing male relatives to intervene. Adultery. Laws were starkly unequal. A cheating wife could be executed. A man cheating with a servant or concubine often faced no punishment. Women's bodies, especially their fertility, were tied directly to family honor. Still, some women rose above legal constraints. Empresses like Lu Ji and Wu Zetian wielded immense power and bent the law to their advantage. In rural areas, widows managing farms or businesses exercised informal authority, even if unrecognized. By law, in short, Chinese legal systems treated women not as individuals, but as parts of the family unit, important, yet secondary to the men who preserved social harmony. Looking across the ancient world, from Babylon to Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one constant remains. Women were included in legal systems, but seldom on their own terms. Most ancient laws defined women in relation to men, as daughters, wives, or mothers. Whether in Hammurabi's code or the Manus Smriti, the underlying assumption was clear: women were vital but subordinate. A widow's legal identity often existed through the men around her. While the law defined her, it rarely empowered her. In some societies like ancient Egypt and Persia, women enjoyed more autonomy. They could own property, sign contracts, and inherit wealth. In these cultures, noblewomen could at times exercise legal authority comparable to men. However, such rights were not widespread. They hinged more on social class, family ties, and individual circumstances than on a belief in gender equality. Elsewhere, such as in Greece and Rome, women faced exclusion despite the presence of advanced legal systems. In Greece, women were legally invisible. Roman women had comparatively more rights, but still operated under male guardianship and strict societal norms. In China, Confucian teachings entrenched the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectations. Law functioned not only as a tool for enforcement, but as a mechanism for preserving cosmic harmony, reinforcing a rigid social hierarchy, especially for women. In Hindu law, veneration of women coexisted with stringent controls and moral expectations. Religious legal systems, such as Jewish halakha or Zoroastrian purity codes, often positioned women at the crossroads of the sacred and the profane. A woman's body could symbolize honor or impurity, blessing or danger, depending on her adherence to religious law. Still, within these structures, women adapted, resisted, and persisted. They found ways to exert influence through familial roles, religious duties, property management, or sheer perseverance. Though their actions often went unrecorded in legal texts or public monuments, their impact shaped families, dynasties, and entire cultures. Ultimately, ancient legal systems reveal not only societal attitudes toward women, but also deeper ideas about power, who possessed it, and who was deemed fit to wield it. Long before the advent of Wall Street or modern banking, financial systems took root in the clay cities of Mesopotamia. Surprisingly, the earliest bankers were not businessmen, but priests. In urban centers like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples were not just spiritual sanctuaries. They were economic and administrative hubs. Farmers and merchants visited temples not only to worship, but to deposit grain, obtain loans, and settle debts. Why temples? Because they were the most trusted institutions. The divine didn't embezzle funds, and scribes maintained thorough records. A farmer delivering grain to the temple granary received a clay tablet with cuneiform markings noting the quantity, date, name, and sometimes a witness. This tablet served as a receipt and an early version of a check. These could be transferred, used to repay debts, or exchanged for goods. In this way, the clay tablet became the ancestor of the promissory note and deposit slip. Temples also issued loans, not just in grain but in silver, livestock, and other goods. Interest rates were steep, around 20% for grain and 33% for silver. These were serious contracts. Failure to repay could mean the loss of land, property, or personal freedom. The idea of compound interest was known and even feared. Some legal codes, like Hammurabi's, sought to regulate lending practices or formalize debt slavery as a consequence. Early banking was raw and often unforgiving, but remarkably innovative. While today's banks operate with spreadsheets and software, their fundamental mechanisms trace back to these ancient systems, where even gods kept ledgers. By the time of Hammurabi, in the 18th century BCE, Babylonian finance had grown more complex and personalized. Though temples and palaces remained key players, a new class emerged: private moneylenders. These early financiers worked from homes, markets, or temple courtyards, offering more adaptable services. Unlike temple loans, often tied to harvest cycles, private lenders could customize terms for traders, artisans, and others, usually dealing in silver, Babylon's primary currency. Coins hadn't yet been introduced, so silver was measured by weight using the shekel. Loans were recorded on clay tablets, detailing parties involved, amount, interest, repayment schedule, and collateral. In cases of default, creditors could claim land, goods, or even family members. Some contracts read more like warnings than agreements. An interesting development was joint liability loans, where two or more people shared repayment duties. This reduced risk for lenders and laid the groundwork for modern co-signed loans. Debt permeated Babylonian life. Farmers borrowed for planting, merchants for trade expeditions, and builders for large projects. Though debt slavery was a threat, legal reforms, such as Hammurabi's Code, offered protections. For instance, crop failure due to storms could exempt a borrower from interest. Babylon also used promissory notes and letters of credit to transfer money over distances without moving physical silver, an early version of wire transfers. These tools allowed merchants to expand operations securely. Babylonian banking shows that even in ancient times, core financial principles, credit, risk, interest, were actively shaping economies. Their tools were made of clay, not code, but the fundamentals were already in play. In ancient Egypt, economic life centered on two constants, the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. Although Egypt didn't develop formal banks like Mesopotamia or Greece, it maintained a complex system of financial management rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and state-run storage centers. Instead of coins, grain was the backbone of Egypt's economy. Wheat and barley were more than sustenance. They were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often settled in sacks of grain stored in central granaries. Egyptian temples mirrored Babylonian ones, doubling as economic centers. Scribes documented deposits, withdrawals, and transactions on pottery shards or papyrus scrolls, serving as contracts and receipts. For example, depositing 10 sacks of grain at a temple in Thebes could earn a receipt, which could be exchanged elsewhere, an early form of a bank draft. Loans were common. Farmers borrowed seed grain for planting, repaying after harvest with interest. Rates could reach 25 to 30%, and enforcement was strict. Default might mean losing land, animals, or labor. Unlike Babylon, Egypt limited private lending. The state dominated large-scale finance, with high officials, priests, and administrators controlling most resources. However, some records show private individuals, including women, acting as local lenders. These examples, though rare, indicate a grassroots level of financial autonomy. Coins arrived in Egypt during the late period due to Persian and Greek influence, but Egyptians continued to prefer grain and barter. This proves that currency isn't just metal. It's about trust, storage, and reliable record-keeping. Egypt's temple-based economy may not have resembled Roman banking halls or Babylon's tough contracts, but it laid the groundwork for enduring financial systems. With the rise of Greek city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE came two major financial innovations: minted coins and professional money changers. Unlike earlier economies that relied on grain or weighted silver, Greece adopted state-regulated coinage, giving rise to a new financial class, the trapezites. Named after the tables, trapeza, where they worked in marketplaces, these individuals functioned as money changers, deposit holders, lenders, and early financiers. They exchanged currency, stored wealth, issued loans, and even maintained accounts, essentially offering primitive checking services. Need to send funds to another city-state? The trapezites could issue a written draft, eliminating the need to carry heavy and risky coinage. This resembled a modern bank transfer, albeit with more dust and fewer servers. Lending was central to Greek finance. Interest rates were high, particularly for risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried 100% interest, justified by the hazards of sea travel. These were backed by detailed maritime contracts outlining routes, cargo, and collateral. If the ship was lost, the loan was nullified. If it succeeded, the payoff was substantial. Private citizens, too, could act as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often issued smaller loans secured by property or slaves. Such deals were formalized with scribes and witnesses and could be enforced in court. In fact, debt cases filled the legal system, illustrating that litigation over money is as old as civilization. Despite their reach, Greek bankers weren't institutional in the modern sense. They operated independently, with reputations rather than regulations serving as their credentials. There were no licenses or protections. If your banker fled with your deposit, the loss was yours alone. Still, the Greek financial network thrived. It enabled commerce, supported military campaigns, and financed public works. In a society built on logic and civic debate, contracts and ledgers became just as vital as philosophy and rhetoric. Ancient Greece demonstrated that once currency gains symbolic value, everything else, debt, profit, risk, follows naturally. When Rome came to dominate the Mediterranean, banking had matured into a powerful economic engine. The Romans didn't invent banking, but they refined and institutionalized it. Finance became deeply embedded in daily Roman life. The Argentari, or Roman bankers, operated from tabernae, shops near the Forum. They performed a range of services, exchanging coins from across the empire, accepting deposits, granting loans, and facilitating third-party payments. Even senators entrusted large sums to these bankers, who maintained ledgers known as rationes, precursors to modern account books. Clients could authorize payments directly from their accounts, creating a basic form of the check. Sending funds to cities like Carthage or Alexandria didn't require traveling with coin. Instead, a letter of credit could be issued by a trusted banker. What truly powered Roman finance, though, was credit. Loans weren't reserved for emergencies. They fueled trade, land purchases, construction, and more. Lending money, even for things like public projects or election campaigns, was legal in ancient Rome, with interest rates usually hovering around 12%, though they could vary depending on the borrower's risk level. Excessively high rates were technically frowned upon, but often ignored in practice. Collateral was essential. Land, slaves, or even one's future earnings could secure a loan. And Rome didn't take debts lightly. If you failed to repay, you could be sued, lose your assets, or in severe cases be enslaved. Unlike earlier civilizations, Rome allowed financial corporations called Societates Publicanorum or Publicani to take on major government contracts, including tax collection. These organizations had investors, managers, and shareholders, functioning in ways strikingly similar to today's banks and hedge funds. But Roman finance wasn't risk-free. These banks had no government safety net. Financial collapses did happen, and records show that when some banking houses failed, they triggered waves of panic. Sound familiar? In the Roman Empire, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates. It connected farmers, merchants, soldiers, and senators. As Rome expanded through conquest, its financial networks grew too, like invisible highways, made not of stone, but of credit, loans, and interest. Even before central banks existed, ancient societies were already experimenting with state control over currency, reshaping how economies worked. Back then, the power to mint coins wasn't just financial, it was political. Whoever issued the money also held the public's trust, and that trust became the foundation of early banking. The first coins appeared in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 BCE. Made of electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy, these stamped pieces marked a shift from weighing raw metal to using standard units of currency. No more weighing silver at the market. Now, value could be seen instantly. Other cultures quickly followed. The Greeks minted drachmas. The Persians produced darics. The Romans built their empire on the denarius. Coins displayed state symbols, Gods, or rulers, not just to indicate worth but to project legitimacy and authority. A coin was both money and a message. With state-issued coins came new behaviors. People stored money in temples, homes, and merchant safes. Lending got easier. Coins were portable, moved fast between city-states, and had consistent value. This helped merchants trade confidently across borders. Early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argentari, adapted to this certainty. Instead of testing weights or purity with each transaction, they tracked coins by type, year, and issuer. This consistency made trade smoother and loans more reliable. Coins also played a role in early monetary policy. Rulers could dilute metal content, reducing purity to stretch the treasury. Though this risked public trust, Roman emperors famously debased coins to pay troops, leading to inflation and instability. Still, the idea stuck. A currency, backed by a state, carrying its symbol and holding steady value. This concept laid the foundation for everything from medieval coins to modern fiat currencies. In many ways, each ancient coin was more than metal. It was a contract, a promise, and a symbol of power. It told you not just what something cost, but who had the authority to decide. In ancient times, faith and finance were often intertwined. Temples weren't just for worship, they were also banks, safes, and lending centers. Why? Because people trusted the gods more than kings, merchants, or traveling moneylenders. Take Delphi, for example. The Temple of Apollo wasn't just spiritual, it was financial. City-states stored war chests there. Wealthy individuals made deposits. Sacred treasuries were built into temple complexes. Other religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as banks, offering security, prestige, and trained scribes to track everything. Under divine protection, temples were considered safer than homes or fortresses. They didn't just store money, they issued loans and sometimes collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests managed lending systems. Repayment came in grain or silver. In Egypt, temples stored wealth in granaries, gave out receipts, and enabled trade. In Greece and Rome, temples held public funds, safeguarded war plunder, and financed building projects and festivals. They weren't passive vaults, they actively lent money. In Athens, the Temple of Athena loaned silver to the state with interest to fund major works. Apparently, gods made for patient lenders. Religious teachings also shaped financial ethics. Ancient Hebrew law, for example, forbade charging interest to fellow Israelites, but allowed it for foreigners. This created a moral line that tied economic behavior to spiritual identity. Hindu texts outlined rules for fair lending, repayment, and even karmic consequences for bad financial conduct. Of course, these systems weren't perfect. Temples could be looted during war, and priests could be corrupt. But for much of the ancient world, temples were the most stable and trusted institutions, enduring through faith and fear. So when picturing ancient banking, don't just imagine dusty coins and cloaked merchants. Picture golden idols, burning incense, and marble halls, because for thousands of years, the safest place for your money wasn't under a mattress. It was under the gods' watchful eyes. Long before credit cards and online loans, ancient economies ran on a system that would still feel familiar today. Borrow now, repay later, with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek trader, or a Roman politician, if you needed capital, you turned to a lender. But ancient lending was often tougher, and the consequences of default more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, interest rates were steep, 20% for grain, 33% for silver, often compounded annually. These weren't seen as abusive. They were the norm. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers knew that if crops failed or caravans were lost, they were still liable. Both temples and private lenders profited from these loans. Unpaid debts could lead to slavery or confiscation of property. In Greece, interest rates varied depending on the loan's risk. Maritime loans were the riskiest, used to fund dangerous trade voyages. If the ship sank or pirates struck, the money was gone, so rates could hit 100% or more. But if the voyage succeeded, both borrower and lender stood to profit enormously. Romans brought strict legal structures to lending. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. Collateral, land, goods, slaves, was detailed. If you missed payments, you could be dragged to court, lose your property, or, in rare cases, become a bonded laborer. Roman law technically capped interest at 12%, but exceptions and loopholes meant this limit was flexible, especially during tough economic times. Still, borrowing was common. Farmers took loans for seeds, merchants borrowed to restock, politicians borrowed to fund campaigns. Lending kept ancient economies running, and defaults were simply part of the risk. And yes, fraud existed. Lenders might demand bribes or tack on extra fees. Borrowers could lie about collateral or vanish entirely. Without credit ratings or regulation, everything depended on trust and reputation. In the end, loans in ancient times were more than transactions. They were power moves. To borrow was to stake your land, your freedom, and sometimes your family on the hope that tomorrow would bring profit. From Mesopotamian grain receipts to Roman silver ledgers, ancient finance wasn't just an economic footnote. It was a foundation. These systems of deposits, lending, interest, and bookkeeping didn't just power local trade. They quietly built the framework for global finance. At the core of every ancient banking system was one key issue: trust. Could you trust that the silver weight was accurate? That the temple's grain wouldn't spoil or be stolen, that your moneylender wouldn't vanish? Out of this need for trust came record-keeping, contracts, and eventually institutional finance. The innovations were impressive. Ancient Babylonians created loan agreements with fixed terms, interest rates, and witnesses, all carved in stone. The Greeks developed early letters of credit to move money across city-states without coins. The Romans organized banker guilds and added debt enforcement into civil law, building a financial web that stretched from Britain to Syria. Many of their ideas still echo today. The modern check has roots in Mesopotamian clay receipts. Collateralized loans trace back to Babylon and Rome. Central banking and monetary policy descend from rulers who adjusted coin content or temple funds to manage economies. As for regulation, ancient societies knew financial crises well. Babylonian. Kings sometimes forgave debts to avoid collapse. Roman emperors capped interest to prevent exploitation. These moves weren't just economic, they were political, designed to preserve order. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of ancient banking is the reminder that finance isn't new. The tools have changed. Tablets became spreadsheets, silver coins became digital numbers. But the underlying human drives remain: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope for gain. So the next time you swipe a card or check your bank app, remember, you're not doing anything revolutionary. You're following in the footsteps of temple scribes, royal mints, and ancient farmers, betting on a better season, because building the future often starts by borrowing from it.